In the heart of Yorubaland, in what is today southwestern Nigeria, a war broke out in 1877 that would last for 16 long years. It became known as the Kiriji War, also called the Ekiti-Iparapo War, and it stands as one of the longest civil wars in African history. This was not a war between strangers. It was a war between brothers of the same Yoruba people. But political ambition, trade rivalry, and the hunger for power tore the region apart. The roots of the conflict went back many years. After the fall of the powerful Oyo Empire in the early 19th century, Yorubaland was left without a strong central authority. Different towns and kingdoms began to fight for control. The city of Ibadan, with its powerful military system and warrior chiefs, rose to become the most dominant Yoruba city. By the mid-1800s, Ibadan controlled large areas of western Yorubaland. They collected tribute, forced smaller towns to obey, and demanded loyalty from their neighbors. But not everyone was happy with Ibadan's rule. The eastern Yoruba groups, made up of the Ekiti, Ijebu, Ijesha, and others, wanted their independence. They saw Ibadan's control as oppressive. This tension would eventually lead to war. The immediate cause of the Kiriji War came in 1877. A conflict broke out between Ibadan and the town of Okemisi in Ekiti. The people of Okemisi, led by Prince Farbunmi, resisted Ibadan's demands. Farbunmi killed an Ibadan agent who had insulted the townspeople, and this act lit the fire that spread across Yorubaland. Soon, towns in Ekiti and Ijesha joined together in an alliance called the Ekiti-Iparapo Confederacy. Their goal was to resist Ibadan and free themselves from domination. The Ekiti-Iparapo did not fight alone. They gained support from the Ijebu and also from external forces like the Ilorin Fulani, who were looking to expand their influence southward. On the other side, Ibadan was determined to maintain control and crush any rebellion. Thus began a war that dragged on for 16 years, with countless battles, ambushes, and destruction across Yoruba towns. The war got its name from the sound of the guns used in battle. The word Kiriji comes from the echo of the cannons and long Dane guns fired during the fighting, a thunderous sound that shook the forests and hills. It was a new kind of war in Yoruba land, no longer just swords, spears, and arrows, but also guns that made terrible noise and caused great destruction. The battles were fierce. In many cases, entire villages were burned, farmlands destroyed, and trade routes closed. Families were separated, and hunger spread as the war made farming and trade almost impossible. What made the Kiriji War different from earlier conflicts was how long it lasted and how wide it spread. Almost every part of Yorubaland was touched by this conflict. Leadership was key on both sides. The Ibadan army was led by generals known as Balogun, war leaders. They were well-trained, disciplined, and experienced from earlier wars. On the side of the Ekiti-Iparapo, leaders like Ojedengbe of Elisha, one of the most famous warriors in Yoruba history, brought skill and bravery to the battlefield. Ojedengbe's leadership gave the Confederacy strength and unity, allowing them to resist Ibadan for many years. The war was not only about military power, it was also about politics and trade. Control of trade routes, especially those leading to the coast, was very important. The Ijebu, who were part of the Ekiti-Iparapo alliance, wanted to protect their trading interests and prevent Ibadan from dominating commerce. This made the war a struggle not just for independence but also for wealth and influence. By the early 1880s, the war had become a terrible burden on the Yoruba people. Both sides suffered heavy losses. Towns were deserted, and refugees fled from one place to another. Despite many attempts to end the fighting, neither side was ready to give up. The British, who were slowly expanding their control in Nigeria, watched the war closely. For them, the conflict was both a problem and an opportunity. It disrupted trade in palm oil and other goods, but it also gave them a chance to step in as peacemakers. Still, the war dragged on. For 16 years, the sound of Kiriji echoed across the hills and valleys of Yorubaland. It was a war of exhaustion, where neither side could completely defeat the other. And as the years went by, the suffering of ordinary people increased. The Kiriji War was more than just a battle for power. It was a war that revealed the weakness of Yoruba unity after the fall of the Oyo Empire. It showed how ambition, rivalry, and foreign interests could tear apart a proud people. But it was also a war that would eventually bring change. Change that came not only from within, but also from the growing influence of the British colonial power. By the mid-1880s, the Kiriji War had dragged on for nearly a decade. Both Ibadan and the Ekiti or Parapo Confederacy had grown tired, but pride and ambition kept the fighting alive. Armies still clashed in forests, on farmlands, and in towns, but the endless battles brought little progress. Each side won some victories, only to lose ground again. For ordinary people, life had become almost unbearable. Farmlands were abandoned, and hunger spread across the land. Families were displaced, and many became refugees, moving from one town to another in search of safety. Markets were empty because traders feared being attacked on the roads. The once thriving Yoruba economy was collapsing. Meanwhile, the British colonial authorities, who had already gained control of Lagos in 1861, were becoming more involved in Yoruba affairs. For the British, the war was not just a local conflict. It was a threat to their growing influence and their trade interests. Palm oil, cola nuts, and other products could not move freely because of the fighting. The British believed that peace was necessary to protect commerce and to expand their power inland. The turning point came in the late 1880s. Both Ibadan and the Ekiti Parapo realized that they could not win the war completely. Their armies were exhausted, and their people were suffering greatly. Leaders on both sides began to consider peace talks. The British used this moment to step in as mediators. They encouraged negotiations, promising that peace would bring stability and trade. One of the most important figures in the peace process was Ojidengbe of Elisha, the great war leader of the Ekiti Parapo. By then, he had become a symbol of resistance against Ibadan. But even he understood that the war could not continue forever. His people were weary, and the destruction was too much to bear. On the Ibadan side, the commanders also knew that prolonging the war would only weaken their city further. After many discussions and failed attempts, a peace treaty was finally signed in September 1886 at a place called Efinale. The British played a major role in bringing the parties together. The treaty officially ended hostilities, although small clashes still happened for some years after. It marked the beginning of the end for the long Kiriji War. But peace came at a cost. With the treaty, the Yoruba people had accepted the presence of the British as peacemakers, giving them a stronger foothold in the region. This opened the door for greater colonial control. By the 1890s, British influence in Yorubaland had grown so strong that local rulers could no longer make major political decisions without them. The aftermath of the war was deeply felt. Many Yoruba towns lay in ruins. Farms had been destroyed, and famine had affected thousands. Populations shifted as refugees settled in new places. The old political order of the Yoruba was never the same again. The war weakened Ibadan's dominance, while the Ekiti or Parapo Confederacy also lost much of its unity. Instead of one strong Yoruba nation, the people were divided and more vulnerable to outside control. For the British, however, the Kiriji War provided an opportunity. By presenting themselves as peacekeepers, they gained trust in some areas and authority in others. Step by step, they used this advantage to bring Yorubaland under colonial administration. By 1893, only a few years after the war, Yorubaland was officially brought under British protectorate rule. The long civil war had made this transition easier, as the Yoruba people were too exhausted to resist strongly. The Kiriji War also left cultural memories that live on today. Songs, stories, and oral traditions still recall the thunderous sound of the Kiriji guns that shook the forests. The bravery of warriors like Ojidengbe of Elisha is remembered with respect, while the suffering of ordinary people serves as a reminder of the cost of division. In the bigger picture, the Kiriji War stands as a warning and a lesson. It shows how disunity among a people can open the door to foreign domination. It also shows the resilience of communities that survived 16 years of destruction and still managed to rebuild. By the time the war ended, Yorubaland had changed forever. The dream of a united Yoruba power, like the days of the Oyo Empire, was gone. Instead, the people entered a new age, one shaped by colonial rule, new economies, and new struggles. The Kiriji War, also known as the Akiti-Parapa War, was more than just a civil war. It was a turning point in Yoruba history. It marked the fall of one era and the painful beginning of another, an era where the Yoruba, like many African peoples, had to live under the rule of foreign powers. And so, from 1877 to 1893, the sound of guns echoed across the hills and forests, but in the end, the war did not produce a winner. Instead, it produced change that shaped the destiny of a people and the history of a nation that would one day become Nigeria.